2 planes, 1 flight. If you saw those words on the thumbnail and felt curious, then you already understand something important. This was not normal air travel. This was something else entirely. Something that, by today's standards, feels almost like a dream someone had about flying before flying became ordinary. The year is 1936. Imperial Airways, Britain's flagship carrier, has just introduced a brand new aircraft to the world. It is called the short S.23 Empire flying boat, and it is about to change what people believe is possible when it comes to traveling through the air. Not because it is the fastest aircraft ever built, not because it flies the highest, but because what happens inside it, from the moment you step aboard to the moment you step off thousands of miles later, is unlike anything that has ever existed in the sky before. And the route it will fly, connecting London to Australia, will become one of the most extraordinary journeys in the history of human travel. But here is the thing that stops you in your tracks when you first learn about it. To fly from England to Australia on this machine, you would not board one aircraft. You would board many. You would land on rivers, harbours, and lakes across 3 continents. You would sleep in hotels in cities you had perhaps never heard of. You would eat in places that felt like another world. And at the centre of all of it, waiting for you each morning on the water, gleaming and white, would be one of these magnificent empire flying boats, ready to carry you a little further toward the other side of the earth. That is the promise of this video. We are going to step inside that aircraft together. We are going to understand what it felt like to be one of the privileged few who could afford this journey. We are going to explore the cabins, the meals, the sounds, the sensations, the stops along the way, and the extraordinary world that existed briefly at the intersection of ocean liner elegance and the raw adventure of early long-distance flight. And we are going to understand why this particular aircraft, this particular era, and this particular route represent something that will never exist again. So let me ask you this at the start. If you could have boarded a flying boat in Southampton in 1936 and flown all the way to Sydney, stopping along the Nile, across the Arabian desert, over the jungles of Burma and the coral seas of the Pacific, what do you think that experience would have felt like? Hold that question, because by the end of this video, you will know the answer in more detail than you ever expected. Let us begin at the beginning. Which means we need to begin with the problem that made all of this necessary. By the mid-1930s, Britain faced a challenge that was both political and deeply personal to its sense of national identity. The British Empire stretched across a quarter of the globe. India was the jewel in the crown. Australia and New Zealand were vast, loyal, and increasingly important. South Africa, East Africa, Malaya, Hong Kong. The empire was enormous, and yet connecting it was agonizingly slow. A letter from London to Sydney could take weeks by sea. Government officials, businessmen, colonial administrators, and wealthy travelers faced journeys that consumed months of their lives. The idea that Britain, the world's greatest empire, could not link its own territories quickly felt almost like a national embarrassment. The answer, it became increasingly clear, was aviation. And the aircraft best suited to flying these enormous distances, over land and sea alike, was not a conventional wheeled aeroplane. It was a flying boat, a machine that could land on water, which meant it needed no expensive, carefully engineered runway at every destination. Almost every major city in the world sat beside a river, a harbour, or a lake. Water was the runway. The empire's geography suddenly looked like a series of perfect landing strips drawn by nature itself. The British Air Ministry issued a specification. They wanted a fleet of modern or capable flying boats, not 1 or 2, a fleet, enough to operate regular scheduled services from Britain to South Africa, to India, to Australia simultaneously. It was an audacious ambition for 1934, which is when Short Brothers of Rochester in Kent received the contract to design and build what would become the S.23 Empire class. What Short Brothers produced was, by any standard of that era, a masterpiece of engineering and design. The Empire flying boat had a wingspan of nearly 34 meters. It was powered by 4 Bristol Pegasus engines, each producing around 900 horsepower. It could carry up to 17 passengers on the longest routes, though sometimes fewer for reasons of fuel and weight. It cruised at around 270 kilometers per hour, which meant that the journey from England to Australia, which took roughly 12.5 days, felt almost miraculous compared to the 6 weeks it could take by sea. But here is where the story becomes genuinely fascinating, and where we need to slow down and step inside. Because when Imperial Airways commissioned this aircraft, they made a decision that separates it from almost everything that would come after. They decided that the passengers who paid for this extraordinary service, and the fares were extraordinary, roughly the equivalent of several £1,000s in today's money for a one-way ticket to Australia, those passengers would travel in a manner befitting their status and their investment. The interior of the Empire flying boat was not designed as an aircraft cabin. It was designed as a statement about what civilized travel could mean in the modern age. Can you imagine boarding an aircraft and finding this? Step with me into the forward passenger cabin of a short Empire flying boat in 1936. You have come aboard via a marine launch that brought you out across the water at Southampton, or perhaps at Hythe on Southampton Water, which served as the Imperial Airways base. You have climbed a short gangway. You have stepped through a hatchway. And now you are inside. The cabin ceiling is higher than you expected. The interior is carpeted. The seats are upholstered in fabric that would not look out of place in a good London club. There are curtains on the windows. The windows themselves are large, offering wide views of the water and the world beyond. The light inside is warm. It does not feel like an aircraft. It feels like the private saloon of a very well-appointed motor yacht, except that in a few minutes it will lift into the sky and carry you south toward a world that most of your friends will never see. The aircraft had multiple separate cabins arranged along the length of the fuselage. On different configurations and at different points in the fleet's history, the layout varied slightly, but the general arrangement placed passengers in a series of connected compartments that allowed for a sense of separation, of privacy, and of progression through the aircraft in a way that simply does not exist on any modern airliner. You could move, you could walk, you could stretch your legs and feel the aircraft around you as something spacious rather than confining. And then there was the smoking cabin. Yes, a designated area where passengers could smoke during the flight. This was 1936, and a world in which a gentleman could light his pipe while crossing the Mediterranean at altitude felt to the passengers of that era entirely as it should be. Now here is where I want to invite you to do something. If you find this kind of history as captivating as I do, take a moment and subscribe to the channel if you have not already. We tell stories like this one regularly. Stories about the lost world of luxury aviation, about experiences that existed briefly and then vanished. Every subscriber helps us keep making them. And now let us get back to the water. The service that the Empire flying boats operated on the route to Australia was called the Kangaroo Route, though it would acquire various names at various times. In its early form, and the England to Australia service combined Imperial Airways operation from Southampton to Singapore with Qantas Empire Airways operation from Singapore to Sydney. 2 airlines, 2 sets of aircraft, 1 extraordinary journey. 2 planes, 1 flight. Now you understand the thumbnail. The journey began at Southampton Water, usually in the early morning. The flying boat would taxi out across the harbour, the 4 Pegasus engines building to a roar, the hull lifting and skimming across the water, before finally breaking free of the surface and climbing into the English sky. Passengers who experienced this moment consistently described it as unlike anything else. The transition from water to air on a flying boat is not the same as a runway takeoff. It is more gradual, more connected to the sea, and then suddenly completely free of it. From Southampton, the route took passengers south across France to Marseille, where a night stop was often taken. The aircraft did not fly at night in these early years. Night flying over unknown terrain with limited navigation aids was considered too risky, which meant that the journey to Australia was structured as a series of day stages, with overnight hotel stops in some of the most interesting cities along the route. This was not merely a practical concession. For many passengers, it was one of the great pleasures of the service. Think about what this meant. You would leave Southampton on a Monday morning. By Friday evening, you might be in Alexandria or Cairo. By the following Wednesday, perhaps Calcutta. By the end of the following week, Singapore, then Darwin, then finally Sydney. And along the way, you would sleep in hotels in Brindisi, in Alexandria, in Basra, in Karachi, in Calcutta, in Rangoon, in Bangkok, in Singapore. Some of these were grand colonial hotels of considerable comfort. Others were more modest rest houses. But all of them were part of a journey that felt like circumnavigating the world, because in a sense you were doing exactly that. And this is where one begins to understand that this was a different way of traveling, not just point to point, not just departure and arrival, but a continuous unfolding experience in which the journey itself was the event. The aircraft was the luxury, the stops were the adventure, and the whole thing was held together by the remarkable reliability and professionalism of Imperial Airways and Qantas crews, who operated across conditions that ranged from the benign English Channel to monsoon-drenched Burma and the scorching heat of the Persian Gulf. Let us talk about what passengers ate and drank, because this is where the Empire flying boat really reveals the philosophy that underpinned it. On longer stages, hot meals were served aboard. The galley on the Empire flying boat was compact by any measure, but the meals that emerged from it were not. Passengers on the earlier stages of the route could expect a proper lunch service, with multiple courses, real cutlery, and food that reflected Imperial Airways' understanding that its passengers expected to eat well. Wine was served. Cocktails were available. The steward who managed the passenger cabin was trained in a tradition that owed more to ocean liner hospitality than to any previous idea of aircraft service. The most surprising thing is that this really happened. In the 1930s, in an aircraft made of aluminium and fabric, crossing the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, the Indian Ocean approaches, and the Bay of Bengal, with meals, wine, and a steward who knew your name and remembered that you preferred your tea without sugar. Afternoon tea was served with particular attention. This was, after all, a British institution, and Imperial Airways was nothing if not a British institution. Sandwiches, cake, and proper tea, served with china cups, somewhere above the Gulf of Oman or the Burmese jungle, while the 4 Pegasus engines hummed and the earth passed far below in its extraordinary variety. Passengers could look out of those wide windows at landscapes that most Europeans had never seen and would never see. The Nile, vast and brown, threading through the ochre desert of Egypt, the mountains of Palestine, the flat, shimmering enormity of the Persian Gulf, the green chaos of the Burmese interior, the islands of the Malay archipelago scattered across a blue sea that looked, from altitude, almost impossibly beautiful. Here is a question worth sitting with for a moment. How many people who made this journey looked out of those windows and simply could not believe where they were? Not just geographically, but existentially. That a human being could leave London on a Monday and be looking down at the Ganges Delta by the following Thursday in a comfortable seat with a glass of something in their hand and a steward nearby. It must have felt like the future arriving all at once. Now, this is a good moment to ask you to share this video, because if you know someone who loves aviation history or who is fascinated by the lost elegance of a different era of travel, they will thank you for sending this their way. And leave us a comment below telling us which part of this journey you would have found most extraordinary. The Nile stop? The crossing of the Arabian desert? The moment the aircraft lifted off the harbour at Singapore? We read every comment. Now let us enter the third and final part of our story. Because everything we have described, the elegant cabins, the meals, the extraordinary route, the overnight stops in colonial cities, the sense of crossing the world in something that felt more like a club than a conveyance, and all of it existed for a very brief time, and that brevity is the thing that gives this story its real emotional weight. The short Empire flying boats entered service in 1936. They were the pride of British aviation. 28 of the original C-class were built, and they operated routes not just to Australia but to South Africa, to India, to East Africa. They were the backbone of Imperial Airways' long-haul network, at a moment when Imperial Airways itself was one of the great symbols of British prestige and reach. Flying on an Empire boat was not merely travel. It was a statement about who you were and where you stood in the world. But the world was already changing in ways that would overtake both the aircraft and the era they represented. In Europe, the political situation was deteriorating through the late 1930s in ways that everyone could feel, but few yet fully understood. Military priorities were beginning to reshape what aviation meant and what it was for. And across the Atlantic, American aviation was developing very fast indeed, building aircraft that would eventually make the flying boat's dependence on water unnecessary. When the Second World War began in September 1939, everything changed almost immediately. The Empire flying boats were requisitioned, repurposed, pressed into military and transport service for which they were not designed. Some were lost in the chaos of the early war years. One was sunk by enemy action. Several were lost in accidents. The gentle world of pre-war luxury that they had embodied, the morning departures across Southampton water, the luncheons over the Mediterranean, the tea above the Gulf, the overnight stays in Basra and Karachi, all of it stopped. After the war, the world that returned was not the world that had left. Air travel was now a strategic industry, reshaped by the needs and technologies of conflict. New land planes, using the runways that had been built across the globe for military purposes, could fly further, faster, and more economically than any flying boat. The infrastructure of the old Empire route, the marine bases, the water moorings, the launch services, all of it was suddenly obsolete. The survivors of the Empire flying boat fleet were withdrawn and scrapped. Not preserved, not celebrated. Scrapped. In the post-war rush toward modernity, toward the land-plane future that would become our present, these aircraft were seen as relics. Inexpensive to maintain, commercially superseded, and associated with a world that the war had ended. By the late 1940s, the Empire flying boats were gone. Not a single complete example survives today. There are components, there are photographs, many of them extraordinarily evocative, there are the memoirs of passengers who made the journey to Australia in 12.5 days and never forgot a moment of it. There are the logs of the captains who flew these machines over deserts and jungles and open ocean with nothing but compass, map, and judgment to guide them. But the aircraft themselves, every single one, are gone. And this is the thing that strikes you when you sit with this story long enough. The Empire flying boats existed for roughly 3 years as the luxury service they were designed to be. 3 years. From 1936 to 1939. In that time they carried a relatively small number of people on a journey that was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most extraordinary travel experiences in human history. And then it was over. The aircraft were gone. The route was transformed. The era ended. And the passengers who had lived it carried the memory of something that most of the world would never know had existed. There is something genuinely moving about that, about the idea of a brief, brilliant thing, a mode of travel so refined, so particular, so connected to a specific moment in history that it could not survive the world's change. The Empire flying boat was built for a world that was already passing as it was designed. It was a product of the British Empire's confidence in its own permanence, its own reach, and its own right to connect its territories in appropriate style. And within a decade of the first departure from Southampton water, the empire itself was beginning to dissolve. What remains is the story. And stories, unlike aluminium, do not get scrapped. If you have made it to this point in the video, then you understand something that most people never will. You understand what it felt like, at least in some approximation, to board one of these aircraft, to feel the morning air off the water at Southampton, to climb into that carpeted, curtained cabin and know that you are about to cross a significant portion of the world in a manner that no previous generation of human being could have imagined. To eat lunch somewhere above France, and dinner somewhere above Egypt, and wake up in a hotel in Basra, and board again, and continue south and east toward a continent that lay a week away. You understand the particular pleasure of a journey that was not merely a means to an end, but an experience worth having for its own sake. And you understand the particular sadness of knowing that this experience was irreplaceable, that when it ended completely. No airline ever rebuilt it. No modern aircraft has ever quite recaptured that combination of elegance, adventure, and the sense that the journey itself was as important as the destination. So here is my final question for you, and I would genuinely love to read your answer in the comments. In the entire history of air travel, is there any era, any route, any aircraft that you believe came closer to making flying feel like a genuine luxury adventure than the short Empire flying boats on the England to Australia service in 1936? I am not sure there is, but I could be wrong, and if you think there is, tell me. Tell me what it was. Tell me why. Because that conversation is exactly the kind of conversation this channel exists to have. If this video gave you something, a new piece of history, a sense of a world you had not quite pictured before, a moment of genuine wonder at what the human capacity for elegance and adventure has produced, then please give it a like. It helps more people find stories like this one. And if you are not yet subscribed and you want more of what you just watched, the subscribe button is right there. We are building something here, a channel about the most extraordinary flying experiences in history, and we would love to have you with us for what comes next. Because next time, we go somewhere else entirely, somewhere even more unexpected, and the aircraft, I promise you, will astonish you all over again,